Good. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Becky, and I'm the Chief Exec of the English Association, and I'm really pleased to be with you this afternoon. A quick word about the EA. We are a learned society and a subject association, which was founded in 1906 to support, promote, and celebrate the discipline of English studies. We cover all stages of education, from primary and early years through secondary and further to higher education and beyond, and we cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers. So thank you very much to Nicola, Ollie, Rachel, and Joe for giving us your time so generously this afternoon. Our members also make it possible to keep these events free and open to all by paying their membership fees. So if you would like to contribute to the national conversation about English and help support our discipline, please do consider joining us. It costs just £55 to support our events and campaigning work for a whole year, and you get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all our journals. Right, that was the bump. Now to the good stuff. So we're here this afternoon to talk about the new close reading archive, and I will just pop the link in the chat so that you can have it open if you want to while we're talking. There we go. So the Close Reading Archive is essentially a massive bank of writing about close reading. So when we got word of the Close Reading Archive that it was a thing, we thought how interesting it would be to find out how we can use it in our teaching. So I'm really pleased that we have some speakers here with us this afternoon to tell us just that. So I will introduce you all briefly, and then I'm going to hand over to Ollie, who's in charge. Nicola, Dr. Nicola Darwood is the Director of the Research Institute for Media, Arts and Performance and is a Senior Lecturer in English Literature at the University of Bedfordshire. Who we got next? Dr. Rachel Roberts was an English teacher for 10 years before moving into higher education, and she's now Assistant Professor of English Education at the IOE at University of Reading, where she runs the Secondary English PGCE and is Deputy Director of the Secondary PGCE programme. And she's also a Fellow of the English Association. Joe Barber is a Senior Lecturer in IT and Subject Lead for the Secondary English PGCE at Manchester Met University. And Joe is also a Fellow of the English Association. Dr. Ollie Bellas is Senior Lecturer across Education and English and Course Lead for the BA Education degree at the University of Bedfordshire. Right, Ollie, you have the bridge.
Thanks very much, Becky, and thanks to those of you in attendance for attending. I'm just going to do a screen share. Becky, give me a thumbs up if that seems to be working. Great, thank you. I said to our speakers that it might be a nice way to start, if a nice way into the discussion of this particular archive, if each of our speakers said something about close reading, their understanding of it, their encounters with it, their experience of it, their experience of doing close reading, but also of having to teach close reading, some or all of the above. One of the reasons that I wanted to start there was that when I was refreshing when I was going back to the close reading archive and reviewing the frankly fantastic teaching resources, the teaching page, I was struck by this quote from John Guillory, on whose book on close reading the archive is based. I was struck by this quote. This quote that speaks of modelling close reading and how important modelling close reading can be for students. I was struck that this idea of close reading is, on the one hand, I would expect, so familiar to all of us, and yet at the same time defining it can be quite tricky, because it sometimes seems to me to be a kind of catch-all term for textual analysis at one end of the spectrum, and then at the other it can seem to be quite a kind of strict procedure or procedural approach to textual analysis. And this quote from Guillory at the top of the page really kind of warns against approaching close reading as too strict a procedure. Anyway, that's by way of kind of background to why I want to start there. So I thought I'd ask each of our speakers to say a few words about close reading, what it is to them, their experience of it, their experiences teaching it. I'll just go in order of speakers as they appear on my screen. So apologies, Nicola, you're up first. Then it's Joe, then Rachel.
Thanks very much, Ollie. Okay, so for background, I class myself as a literary historian. So I'm interested in context and all the things that get taught to A-level students, but also I engage in, as everybody does, with close reading. And I had pre-warning of this question, so I did a bit of Googling, mostly on the database, actually, because that seemed like a good place to start. And there were 3 quotes that really struck me. One is from Bob Eagleson, who says that it's an open-ended conversation with a text. Gustavo Perez Fermat said close reading is really slow reading and intimate reading. And I love that idea of taking our time over a text and really getting to the nub of what the author is trying to convey and how we can gain meaning from that. But also with my hat as a literary historian on, where I try to combine the context with the content, I came across a quote from Jed Detman about the role of close reading in genetic criticism, which is another thing I'm really quite interested in, about how novels get changed and how we can find the original, so to speak, and trace things back. And he says most geneticists are zealously committed to close reading, even more than the new critics were. We love our texts so much that we want to know what they were like as children. And that to me sort of said, yeah, this is what it's all about. It's about finding, it's exploring, it's being a detective, it's uncovering meaning from a multitude of different texts. So that was my in and my first thoughts about it. How I teach it is a whole different ballgame, and I'll come to that perhaps a little later on.
Thanks, Nicola. I did say, Joe, I said you were second, didn't I? The order of people on my screen has now changed, but I'm going to go in original order. So Joe next, then Rachel.
Okay, thank you. Ollie, would you like me to share my slides at this point, or?
Whatever suits Joe. So I think a few words from you on close reading, as you've experienced it, then to Rachel, and then we were going to go to how the 3 of you have started to play around with the archive in your own teaching. But if it makes sense for you to share slides now, go for it.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, thank you. And it's kind of in two parts anyway, which address both of them. So I can always pause at the end of the first slide anyway. So hopefully you can see my slides there. Just to begin with a bit of context, really, I'm a teacher educator at Manchester Met University, and I was an English teacher for 14 years, and I've been a teacher educator for the last 10 years. And I suppose my interest in close reading came about through my own experiences as an undergraduate many years ago, and I had to study a course. But I was very glad that I did have to study it in my first year as an undergraduate, which looked at, I suppose, literary criticism, as we might call it, but introduced me to certain theories of close reading that I came to realise in time were all had something in common, which was paying close attention to the words on the page and patterns and tensions across pieces of writing, and also thinking about the reader's proximity to that text and very much interpolating the reader within that process of making meaning. And that was quite revolutionary for me, I think, really. Given my educational background at the time, it was very liberating and quite empowering. So I thought what I'd do is just share with you a piece of research that I did a few years back now, which grew out of that interest, that long-standing interest in close reading. And the research, one part of the research asked the participants to tell me why they decided to study literature at university. And A-level was a factor that recurred in the answers that the participants gave. And they talked about A-level as a phase of their education when their identity as a reader really developed because of two things, really. Firstly, the encouragement and expectation that was given to them or expected of them to read analytically and quite forensically the literature that they were going to sit and examine. And they often talked about that experience as being really quite rewarding and enjoyable, but also quite novel, excuse the pun, in comparison to their GCSE experiences. And alongside that, or as a secondary aspect, was the encouragement for them from their teacher to really fully engage in an active interpretation and possibly even venturing into acts of criticism and realizing aspects of their own taste and things that they did or didn't agree with, or they did or didn't see in the text as being relevant. The same piece of research also suggested that aside from that phase of learning at A-level, the skill of close reading or working faithfully with the words on the page came to be replaced when they became undergraduates. So all of the participants in the study had they'd done a literature degree as undergraduates. They talked about how they'd essentially replaced that method of reading, close reading, with an engagement with theory, which they often described in various ways, pertaining to it being very difficult and a bit impenetrable, I suppose. But they had to demonstrate their ability to understand the theory and then overlay that on the text so that they could discover big issues within the text. For instance, one student talked about Jane Eyre as a novel about colonialism. Jane Eyre is a novel about colonialism, and that, they'd said, had come about through their engagement with theory. And at the same time as this, their relationship with close reading seemed to become more and more murky. They were less clear about when they were doing it, when they should do it. And as a teacher educator leading a PGCE course for secondary English teachers, this really started to kind of land with me as a question about what responsibility I had, I suppose, to bring this into their world as their tutor on the course. And that led to me doing various things on the PGCE programme to try and bring that into their experience of training to teach a little more. It also arose from my own observations of student teachers in the classroom, tending to approach, in particular, poetry line by line, starting at the beginning of the poem, and taking an analytical approach that dealt with things as they encountered it, but often not making connections across the text. So the margins would be full of annotations, but often the thinking wouldn't be joined up. So I suppose that more the forensic detail of close reading, coupled with the sort of overview that close reading also invites to think about what the big ideas might be. I started to see that struggling. So that led to me thinking about what I did on my own PGCE course, and perhaps I can return to that in a little while, Ollie, and hand back the floor to somebody else, to Rachel.
That's great. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so over to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Becky. Would you mind showing my slides? Thank you. So, like Joe, I also run a secondary English PGCE at the University of Reading, and I've come at this really from the moment I'm in the middle of school visits. I'm rushing around the county, seeing lots and lots of lessons in secondary classrooms, and so that's kind of been my framework, my lens for thinking about close reading and how it works in English lessons. Thanks. Can I have the first slide, please, Becky? And one of the lessons I have observed fairly recently use this. You can probably work out fairly quickly where this is from. Got it? No prizes for guessing. it is Peter Pan, and this was from a Year 7 lesson, and it was on the topic of heroes and villains. So this was a description of Captain Hook from Peter Pan. I thought this was really interesting. So the kind of the nub of the lesson was looking at how he's presented, how he's described in the novelisation of the play, and as part of the lesson, the teacher went through and sort of directed it. So did a little bit of co-construction of analysis of what I seemed to see as being close reading, of picking out particular phrases or adjectives and other ways of describing him in the course of the lesson, and then directed them through a series of questions, some of which were written down, to continue that close reading, that close analysis of themselves by themselves, which then led into something that he was looking for them to write up. So I thought this was quite indicative of the kind of ways in which we see close reading probably functioning in the secondary classroom. I appreciate it is a little bit different in terms of how close reading is conceptualized in probably the English national curriculum compared to the States, because it doesn't feature as a kind of official term or approach in the national curriculum compared to the core content core standards over in the States. So it does have a slightly different role, perhaps, although it is kind of effectively referred to in the assessment objectives at Key Stage 4 for us. Could I have the next slide, please? Becky, thank you. So I would argue that close reading is probably in some form or other, even if it is very short amount or small amount of it, is probably the bread and butter of most English lessons, particularly ones that focus on literature. However, that idea of it being sort of contextless in the kind of in the original I.A. Richards approach of not having any information about the writer or the context in which it was written, I don't think you can't really properly read entirely free of context or any kind of knowledge, because the reader brings knowledge to the reading themselves. So straight away, children would recognise Peter Pan. They'll have some knowledge and some preconception of what Captain Hook is like from different adaptations, whether it's cartoon versions or whatever. They'll bring something to that reading that will be outside of the text, that will develop and enhance and contribute to their meaning making through the context of reading it. And I was particularly struck in Guillory's book, in the introduction to the book, which is connected with the archive, of how he describes techniques, and this was in your introduction as well, Ollie. Techniques are transmitted by demonstration and imitation, and that the technique of close reading can be described but not prescribed. So it's so although we might try to sort of codify it in some way in terms of what we might be looking for, it's something that has to be sort of done alongside, which is why I've put a picture of what's very, very common now in English lessons, is use of a visualizer to share a text and do some sort of close analysis led by the teacher, perhaps, and ideally sort of, again, sort of co-construction with taking the pupils with them, and making the visualizer as the kind of the point of dissemination and that point of context and point of contact rather. However, I do think there are some issues if close reading is taken in a very sort of purist form in terms of its function in a classroom, and this applies to, I think, to all levels of English teaching, really. And we do need to think about the kind of reading that's taking place. Now, Rosenblatt would describe this as being something to do with how the reading is framed. How it's framed, whether it be efferent reading, something that focuses on what might be taken away in terms of meaning, or an aesthetic reading, which might forefront an aesthetic or emotional or affective response. And as teachers, we frame that. Now, it doesn't mean to say that you won't necessarily have a child who will engage with the text through some close reading and take a very efferent stance towards it, because they perhaps are very minded of perhaps a test or an exam or something that they have coming up, and therefore they are looking at kind of key information that they kind of need to sort of grab and hold on to and take away so that they can respond in a particular way. But the teacher can frame that. They can frame how we respond, our stance that we take in the classroom towards reading of a text. And I think we do need to remember there's a difference between a reading and the reading. And sometimes it can be the case that, depending on how it's done, a pupil, a student can see the ways in which a teacher or a lecturer does the reading is the correct version. And that not necessarily there being space for recognizing that there are possible multiple ways of interpreting a text or concluding a reading, and so we can elide pupils' response if you're not careful, if we're not careful. And I'll just end this little section. I've got there's another slide with a diagram from Rosenblatt, but I'll just end by saying, having said all of that, one of the best lessons I've ever seen from a training teacher a couple of years ago was her effectively doing close reading aloud. So she had a poem. She had not looked at it before the lesson. She didn't know who had written it. She had no information about it at all. It was completely unseen for her. And she read the poem, she analysed the poem, she talked it through under a visualizer with was a year 10 class. There was sort of 14, 15-year-olds, and did her analysis of it aloud. So she was kind of talking aloud. She was demonstrating in the way that maybe perhaps Guillory is suggesting in his introduction, the process of close reading. It was genuinely fascinating, and I had a really interesting relationship with it because I recognised the poem, having taught it myself. It happened to be a Simon Armitage poem about 9/11, a description of the man falling from the top of one of the Twin Towers. But it's not explicitly described in the poem, so you wouldn't know that unless you had other information about the poem itself. So it was really interesting to see that in practice. So it can be really powerful, I think, as a tool in the classroom. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thanks for that, Rachel. Just before I bounce back to Nicola, would you, if the answer to this is no, by the way, it's fine. Would you be able to just elaborate a little more on you glossed over quite quickly the difference between efferent reading and aesthetic reading. Anyone who's not steeped in Rosenblatt might appreciate a slight elaboration.
Sure, absolutely.
Asking for a friend, obviously.
Yeah, not at all. Yeah. It's on the following slide, actually, on the PowerPoint. There's a diagram that she created. So this comes from her idea of transactional reading and what that consists of. Her focus is on moving away from. So she wasn't anti close reading, but she felt that what was missing from that dynamic was the role of the reader. She didn't really believe a text existed until somebody read it, until they get engaged with it. For a teaching point of view, that means obviously the child, the pupil, the student. An efferent reading means from Latin meaning to sort of carry away, to take away. So she said the stance that you take when you approach the reading of a text will frame how you will engage with it. And you might, so if she gives the example of somebody reading the side effects of a drug that you might take because you're poorly. When you're reading that, you're not reading that for an aesthetic response to see how you might emotionally be, moved by the quality of the prose and the beauty of the language. You want key information about what might happen to you if you take this particular drug, right? So that, she would say, it is a way of framing an efferent reading. You want to take some information away from that. On the other end of the spectrum, and she considers this as a continuum, and in her chapter from which I've taken the diagram on the PowerPoint, she considers this to be a continuum. The other end of the continuum is sort of an affective or aesthetic reading, and that's where there's space to respond to something on an emotional level. And again, she said that it's definitely a sliding scale between one response and another, depending on how we might set up the classroom, how you might frame it. If the whole framing of an approach to teaching of a text is you will need to know X for the exam, that is going to frame a way of responding to something that would be quite different to an aesthetic reading of a text.
That's great, thank you. And there's a link there with some of Nicola's opening remarks, I think, as well, because we think of the sorts of pressures that exams put on us and our students. They don't encourage close reading as slow reading.
Absolutely. Yeah.
in many ways, right?
Yeah.
And this idea, Rosenblatt's idea of the sliding scale, is another really interesting one, because of course we can read a text that in most contexts you would assume was designed for efferent reading, and yet we might still have an aesthetic and emotional response to reading a list of side effects on the
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where the nature of the text itself, it has to be read in partly in a context, but also it's recognizing where perhaps the purpose of the text or the intended purpose of it, but without that being there is only one way of receiving a text, and I think I think that's the issue that close reading is really powerful. Like I said, it's kind of the bread and butter of what we do. But if there's not a connection there, in terms of how the reading is framed, how it's approached, and that absolutely impacts our pedagogical approaches, then we're missing something.
Yeah.
And the students will miss something.
That's great, thank you. So Nicola, I'm going to come back around to you in just a moment. Before I do, just to say to our attendees, as of now, please do post any questions that you might want to ask into the chat function, and between us, Becky and I will try and keep an eye on the questions as they come through, and we'll feed as many as we can to Nicola, Joe, and Rachel. So, Nicola, this is the point then when you might say a few words about ways in which you have tried to use either the archive itself or simply the ways in which you've kind of brought close reading practices into your classroom, into your seminar room. And you're on mute.
You'd think after all these years I'd know to unmute myself. Can I have the slides, please, Becky? So for background, I'm teach undergraduates and postgraduates, a broad range of English literature units. I teach the first year as a survey course, which covers a load of different theory, and also introducing them to prose and to poetry and to plays. And the second and the third year, I do other things, Victorian literature and a whole variety of things. But there's always an interesting thing about how to persuade students to really engage closely with the text. They have a lot to read, and it's slow reading is not something that they're necessarily good at. So it's a question of how to encourage them to do that. And I became aware of the archive through Ollie, and I was thinking about how I might use it, and I decided to use it as a teaching tool within seminars, one for my first year students and one for my second year students. So using the archive really to introduce or to reintroduce the students to the idea of close reading, and also to help develop their skills. May I have the next slide, please, Becky? So for each of the two sessions that I ran, so one with the first years and one with the second years, I posed these 4 questions. What is close reading? Why do we, and I included myself in this, engage with close reading? What techniques can we use? And how it can improve our work. So I had asked the first years initially if they would just have a look at the archive, play around with it, see what they thought about it, consider how valuable it might be for their own studies. And it was very much an unguided activity, and they came back and they said, it's okay, it was useful, not really sure how we could use it. So I thought, okay, so we'll have some really some structured engagement with the archive. And so this is what we got, the 4 questions. And when we were doing it, I suggested to them first that they should look at the resources section, which is absolutely brilliant and amazing, and then to look at the archive, the historical archive. And I gathered together a series of responses. Can I have the next slide, please, Becky? And these are sort of the general comments that they came up with, that close reading is about paying close attention to form, to style, to word choice, to imagery and argument. We can all agree with that. But then it got really interesting. You need to engage, one of the students said, with the text on the personal level. If it's boring, why is it boring? If you love it, why? Which I thought was really quite interesting, because so often I say to students, well, what did you think about the text? Well, I didn't really like it very much. Why didn't you like it very much? And so they've got used to me asking those questions and thinking that they have to look deeper into the text and do think more closely about what the author is trying to do. And another student talked about having to slow down, that you can't do a close reading if you're just galloping through the text in order to get the reading done for the week. So I liked that idea. I thought that was a good idea. I gave them a big mental tick. And that way that they can think about the author's choices, and then to think about it in terms of an in-depth analysis. So this is the material, the words, the sentences that the students are coming up with, having engaged with the archive. Could I have the next slide, please? So all those are quite positive, but the next two are not so positive. One student said, well, it's really difficult. She said, I can talk about the historical context, I can go and look up the history, I can go and look up about the author's life, but to actually do the close reading, that's really asking me to do a whole different thing that I'm not used to doing. And also that it can be very time consuming. Yes, because it's slow reading. And then one of the students asked if their response would be the same as somebody from the 20th century, which I love that idea, or the time of publication. And then they came to the conclusion, which I have tried to impress upon them many times, that it's our interpretation, that we do that close reading, we come to our own understanding of the meaning of the words and what the author might have tried to be getting across, and all the other things that you can do with a text. So that was one part of the exercise. And then the second part of the exercise, can I have the next slide, please, Becky, was to pose them an essay question, not one that they were going to go off and write, but one that they would think about during the session, and come to some conclusions, having worked on the archive and having got some of that material and those sources, those quotations. So the question is, what's the relevance of close reading in 21st century literary studies? The first years, yeah, they sort of engage with it, but they're at the sort of start of their undergraduate studies. The second years grasped it with both hands and went to town on it. As you can see from the next slide, which is a rather poor photograph of the essay plan that they came up with. It's my writing, so I hope you can read it. And I realise that there's a duck right at the very top, which is my mug cover. He sneaked in unexpectedly. So they were thinking about the pros and the cons of doing a close reading and how they could incorporate this into an essay. And they talked about the in-depth analysis and the patterns and so on. There's a quote from Virginia Woolf that one of them fell in love with. They're also very appreciative of the English and Media Centre archive material, the material that they put together. So thinking about how they would construct an essay about whether or not it's relevant in 21st century literary studies. So the pros and the cons about the difficulty of finding quotations, the time that it takes because it requires at least 3 readings of a text to really start to get that understanding, that it's time specific to the reader. So what a reader in the 21st century understands from a text is not the same as somebody else. And the difficulty in the fact that meaning fluctuates and that meaning isn't fixed. So I thought that were really interesting ideas about both the positives of close reading, but also the difficulties. They saw them as cons. I see them more as difficulties and exciting difficulties, things that they need to get around. But then we started talking about the spectrum and the sliding scale between sort of close reading at the one hand, so that A.I. Richards' practical criticism at the one hand, but new historicism on the other, and where they would like to place their own literary work. Now, I'm a literary historian, as I say, but I also enjoy doing close reading. So I'm probably slap bang in the middle. I'm one of those fence sitters. I just slap bang in the middle. It's really interesting to see them start to think about where they would put themselves on that continuum, how they saw themselves. They see themselves as a close reader. Where does theory come into close reading? What is the role of the historical context, which obviously as A-level students they had focused on so much. So altogether, it was a really interesting example of using a resource not as as a resource for their own essay writing, for their own thinking, rather than something that you just go to pick up information. And I think doing the essay plan, make them think through how they would use close reading, was really quite an effective way of doing it. So yeah, that's what I did with my students. Hopefully I haven't marked them yet, but I'm hoping I'm going to see a huge jump in their abilities to do close reading. I would have to report back on that in a few weeks' time, I think. That's me. Thank you, Ollie.
Thanks, Nicola. That's fascinating, isn't it? And particularly the I was thinking exactly as you were, the kind of the idea of it's difficult, and some of us teachers naively going, yes, and isn't that great? Where of course it's very often sometimes it's difficult is meant as a complaint, but to how to reframe that difficulty as something positive and something to be embraced is an interesting question for me, certainly. I'm very aware of the time, so I'm going to come back round. We've probably got enough time for Nicola. That's your second turn, so we've probably had enough time for Joe and Rachel to have another turn each. Joe, I don't know if you'd prefer to go back to your slides, or if you would like to respond to the question that has been put to you in the chat. The question was visible to everyone, and I messaged it to you directly. The question is, for any attendees who haven't been able to read it yet, were there any English student teachers you interviewed who did not study A-level English Lit or Lang, or did not study English at university before becoming English teachers? If so, did this affect their close analysis of texts?
I've replied to Sheila in the chat. Sorry, Ollie, I didn't want to interrupt, but I typed a response before. The short answer is no, I didn't, because the criteria that I used for selecting participants in the study was that they had to have completed an English Lit degree at undergraduate.
Thanks.
That was because I was curious to understand why certain practices, certain methods for teaching literature in the classroom, why I was observing it. It seemed to kind of eschew some of the disciplinarity of close reading, that paying close attention to the text and, paying attention to style and techniques, and actually an overemphasis on context was what I was observing. And I wondered why people who've done a literature degree at university were tending to feel more secure in the company of context rather than dealing with text. So I've answered it twice now. Sorry about that. Okay, so in terms of what I did, I'm lucky enough to be able to create the curriculum and revise the curriculum of the PGCE course that I lead. And what I decided to do was to try and firstly use some of the sessions that we already have on the programme, the PGCE English programme, but perhaps just try and fine tune them a little bit more. So there was a focus on close reading. So I did that, but also when I was introduced to the close reading archive by Ollie and Becky, and had a look through it and was really kind of captivated by some of the stuff that I read, being already interested in close reading, I saw opportunities, I suppose, to weave that into the sessions that existed. And in fact, towards the end of the teaching block that we had in the early spring, focused much more on the archive, using some resources from the archive itself. What I did, what I've always done with the students for the past number of years, really, is try to provide the student teachers with a method for dealing with any text that they might come to study. That was something that I realised that they couldn't do very well, and in fact they said that they weren't very confident in preparing a text for teaching. They didn't necessarily know what to focus on or what to begin with, and often when I did observations, I'd see that the student teachers would focus on simile and rhyme. And when I asked them, why did you focus on those things when you were teaching the text today? They just said, well, I'm not really sure what else to focus on. They seemed to see that focus as being quite random, that they could focus on anything that stood out to them rather than it being perhaps a little bit more methodical or systematic in their approach to analysing the words on the page. So I tried to give them a teacher tool, essentially, to be able to approach or have a method for approaching any text that they could then take into their classroom. The method that I shared with the student teachers is not something that I advocated using with pupils in the school. it was kind of set up to be used by somebody who already had quite a lot of experience as a reader. And I linked it to the GCSE assessment objectives, the GCSE and A-level assessment objectives, in particular AO1 and AO2. Firstly, AO1, which rewards students for being able to develop informed personal responses, and AO2 for both GCSE and A-level, which rewards students for being able to really pay attention to language, to style, to technique, and really identify how a poet, a playwright, a novelist has an effect on the reader, or is able to generate an idea in a particular way. So, and I did that in particular because I thought that for student teachers who have a rage for order and a desire to survive their PGCE, to try and marry that as much as possible with the assessment objectives that they're working with day in, day out in school. I'd also previously done some sessions with the students where we looked at paintings and examples of fine art to try and alienate them from the linguistic process of reading and focus much more on visual texts, to show them how they could apply a similar kind of reading method to focus on the use of colour, composition, symbolism, how, going back to what Rachel was saying before about Rosenblatt's schema, the idea that they might all focus on a particular use of colour. We looked at Munch's screen, how they might focus on a particular use of colour, but each of them would come up with slightly different ideas, and how that was something to be celebrated, and took us away from this idea of what Gary Snapper's referred to as certificated reading in the classroom. That is the kind of reading that comes from the teacher reader, which, as Rachel said before, perhaps elides the students' responses to the point where they feel that it's not really worthwhile sharing what they've done. This year, what I've done, having discovered the archive, was I married it with a session that we do where we use the local area where our university building is based. And we're quite lucky because we've got, you can see on the slide there, the Joy Division Bridge. We've got a pub around the corner, the Salutation, where Charlotte Bronte wrote parts of Jane Eyre whilst her dad was having his cataracts operated on. The site of the Moss Side riots, lots and lots of great cultural references that we invite the students to think about their relationship to. So marrying it with some creative writing and thinking about the benefits of off-site learning. But we asked them to choose, I selected 5 resources from the archive, and they had to engage with all 5 of them in groups. And then they went off and did a piece of writing and brought their writing back to the classroom. And then anonymously, they presented their writing, shared their writing with the group, and then anonymously somebody would read their work and perform something like a practical criticism of their text, explaining as they went how they'd use the resource from the archive. And I think one of the most significant outcomes from that was the realization that often readers could find within their writing, that another person's writing, examples of stylistic choices and devices and techniques and methods and linguistic choices that the writer themselves had not necessarily intended to be picked up on, but actually they were very credible as a basis for interpretation. So that was one of the key things that the students took away from it. And looking ahead to next year, I'm already thinking about how we can further embed some of this, because I've seen that it has been quite impactful for the students, particularly in terms of their confidence when it comes to teaching literature in the classroom, that they feel that there is in fact a thing, a method that has a name, and we might not all agree on what close reading means, what it is and how it's done, and that it is a very broad category. But I certainly felt that for my student teachers on my programme, that it gave them more security and more confidence in being able to deal with literature that they otherwise have never encountered before, or thought they knew, but have been reading it in a slightly different way. I'll end there because I'm conscious that we're short of time.
Thanks ever so much, Joe. And yeah, we're gonna run a few minutes over, but I hope people are able to stay with us Because we are short of time, I'll just say that we've had a few really thoughtful, really provocative questions come through in the chat, and some wonderful responses to those. So as we're moving towards the end, please feel free to read the questions and responses, to add your own responses to, should you wish. Rachel, back to you.
I've got one more slide to show, and really, I think this is maybe more focused on the archive itself, because what I did is I asked other people what they would do with it, and I had a couple of responses from. Oh yeah, so this is the Rosenblatt stuff, but we can skip through this, Becky. To that final slide. So one of my PGC students, and honestly, I think my PGC students, because I haven't seen them for long enough to be able to kind of actively do something in the way that Joe has, which I'm completely going to steal for next year, Joe, for my next cohort. So I've just shared it with them and asked them if they have a chance to look at it to see what they think of it. One said that she thought it would be really helpful for perhaps teaching A-level unseen prose, which I thought was interesting, using that what, why, and how source. And one of my colleagues, she picked this apart a little bit more and picked out some things that she felt were really applicable at school, mostly around A-level teaching. So for NEAs, and if you don't know, and NEA is a National Extension Award. So these are sort of additional sort of research projects that sixth schools do alongside their A-level courses. So she thought it'd be helpful for perhaps using it in that context. She also thought, in terms of departmental or CPD and sort of discussion within the English department, would be something that would benefit from engaging with some of the materials in the archive. And I love that she just sort of splurged this email to me last week. Some of the archive material is basically a lesson waiting to happen, setting up critical points of view for students to argue for or against. And I thought that was a really nice way of thinking about it. That this is a huge resource that she said to me she got a bit sort of down different rabbit holes. So it was really interesting that one thing leads to another, and you can sort of pick your way through it. And she thought that there was kind of something for everyone within the archive itself, which I thought was a great way of thinking about it.
Thanks, Rachel. That's great. We are slightly beyond 5:30, so I think I'll hand back to Becky for closing remarks in just a moment. But I think really thank you to all three of you. I wish we had longer. I'm going to make my bid now, based partly on Joe's comments. I'm going to make my bid now for a follow-up session on creative writing as a responsive mode of close reading. I think that'd be a great session. Perhaps I'm biased, but I think that'd be wonderful. Thanks to all three of you. Thanks to all of our attendees. Becky, back to you. And thanks very much to Becky for organising this event, I should say, before handing back to her. Yeah, this is happening because of Becky. So thank you, Becky.
Oh, what a joy. Thank you. Fantastic session. Thank you for so much engaged chat. It's just fantastic. So this recording will be available on our website, so we can keep dipping into it and remind ourselves as we look forward to part 2, Ollie, because you're on. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.